السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. This is a video recording for the physiology lecture on cardiac electric activity in the cardiovascular block. These are the active learning objectives, the intended learning outcomes, the ILOs for this learning activity, and here we have the learning resources for this lecture. We mentioned in the previous lecture that the heart has 4 essential physiological properties which enable it to function as the central pump of the cardiovascular system. These physiological properties include autorhythmicity, which is the ability of the heart to generate its own cardiac impulses independent of any extrinsic stimulation, and this is what we call automaticity. And these cardiac impulses are generated in a regular rhythmical way, and this is what we call rhythmicity. Together, automaticity and rhythmicity are collectively referred to as autorhythmicity. Then the second physiological property is the ability of the heart to conduct these cardiac impulses to reach the contractile cells, the myocytes, in the walls of the atria and interatrial septum and the walls of the ventricles and interventricular septum to excite and stimulate them to contract. So the second property is conductivity, and the third physiological property is excitability. These 3 properties, autorhythmicity, conductivity, and excitability, are the electrophysiological properties of the heart. The 4th property is the contractility, which is the mechanical property of the heart and the mechanical response to excitation. In this lecture, we shall focus and describe the electrophysiological properties of the heart in more details. As we also mentioned in the previous lecture, there are 2 main types of cells in the heart: the cells of the specialized conduction system of the heart. These are non-contractile cells, and the contractile cells in the walls of the atria and interatrial septum and the walls of the ventricles and interventricular septum, and we call these contractile cells the cardiac muscle fibers, the myocytes, the working cells, or the mechanical cells. So the heart is capable of generating rhythmical electrical impulses, which we call them the cardiac impulses, independent of any extrinsic stimulation. And this property is the automaticity and the rhythmicity combined together. This is autorhythmicity. The cardiac impulses are normally generated in the sinoatrial node, and hence the sinoatrial node functions as the normal pacemaker of the heart. The cells of the specialized conduction system of the heart conduct and carry these cardiac impulses to the myocytes in the atria to excite them, and then after repose to the myocytes in the ventricles to excite them. And this property is the conductivity. And when the myocytes are excited and respond electrically and mechanically, this property is the excitability followed by contractility. The cells of the specialized conduction system of the heart are found in the sinoatrial node, where the impulses are generated, and the AV node, and we also have internodal pathways between the 2 nodes, We have anterior, middle, and posterior internodal pathways. And we have a pathway between the two atria. And this is what is known as the Pitman bundle. Then from the AV node arises the AV bundle or bundle of His, and the bundle of His divides into left and right bundle branches, and we have the fine terminal branches of the left and right bundle branches, which are the Purkinje fibers. The primary difference between the cells of the specialized conduction system and the contractile myocytes is that the cells of the specialized conduction system lack myofibrils because they do not need to contract, so they show little or no contraction. We shall now describe the electrophysiological properties of the heart in more details. We will describe the excitability, then we will describe autorhythmicity, and in the latter part of the lecture we will describe conductivity. So we will describe all these three electrophysiological properties in more details during this lecture. However, before describing these electrophysiological properties of the heart in more details, let me first explain the resting membrane potential, because it is the basis for all the three electrophysiological properties of the heart. The voltage across the membrane of the cardiac muscle cell of a myocyte when it is in the resting state can be measured using two microelectrodes and a galvanometer. A galvanometer is the device which measures the voltage. One of these two microelectrodes is inserted into the cardiac muscle cell and kept very close to the inner surface of the membrane, and the other electrode is placed on the outer surface of the membrane. Thus, the voltmeter will be measuring the voltage across the membrane, the potential difference between the inner surface of the membrane and the outer surface of the membrane when the cardiac muscle cell, the myocyte, is at rest. This voltage or potential across the membrane when the myocyte is at rest is known as the resting membrane potential. And when we measure it, we'll find that the intracellular potential of the resting myocyte is about -80 to -90 millivolts. In other words, the intracellular potential of the resting myocyte is 80 to 90 millivolts lower than the extracellular potential. This is again known as the resting membrane potential. In the atrial and ventricular cells, this resting membrane potential is stable, and the cells would remain in resting state, would remain in relaxation and in diastole until a stimulation is arrived or until the cells are excited. The stimulation arrives from the sinoatrial node through the specialized conduction system, and also from cell to cell, because from myocyte to myocyte, because we have intercalated discs between the myocytes. And when the cells are excited, now the voltage across the membrane changes. So in the atrial and ventricular cells, the resting membrane potential remains stable until they get stimulated by a cardiac impulse from the sinoatrial node. On the other hand, in the sinoatrial nodal cells in particular, and in many conduction fibers, the resting membrane potential is not stable. Rather, it changes spontaneously to less and less negative values, and it drifts towards zero with time. In fact, the voltage across the membrane of the sinoatrial nodal cells is known as the pacemaker potential. I do not like calling the voltage across the membrane of the sinoatrial nodal cells resting membrane potential, because the sinoatrial nodal cells are never at rest. Because if the sinoatrial nodal cells were at rest at some time, this would mean that the sinoatrial nodal cells would require a stimulus to stimulate them, which is not the case. In fact, the cells of the sinoatrial node are the ones which spontaneously generate the cardiac impulses, which spontaneously generate the stimuli which are conducted and excite the contractile cells to contract. The electrical potentials across the membrane arise as a result of differences in the concentrations of ions across the membrane and the presence of selective ion-conducting channels spanning the membrane, namely the potassium and the sodium and the calcium channels. So here we have a resting ventricular myocyte where the concentrations of sodium ions and calcium ions are high in the extracellular fluid and low in the cytoplasm, low in the sarcoplasm. On the other hand, the concentration of potassium ions is high in the sarcoplasm compared to its concentration in the extracellular fluid. In the resting state, the membrane is permeable to potassium. We have leak potassium channels in the membrane which are open when the membrane is in the resting state. On the other hand, the membrane is almost impermeable, or I would say the membrane is relatively impermeable to sodium in the resting state. So having said so, potassium ions move across the membrane from the sarcoplasm out into the extracellular fluid down their concentration gradient, carrying with them positive charges, because potassium ions are positively charged ions. The negatively charged intracellular ions, mainly the organic phosphates and the intracellular proteins, cannot accompany the potassium ions because the membrane in the resting state is impermeable to them. Thus, the efflux of potassium ions across the membrane in the resting state and the inability of the negatively charged intracellular ions to accompany the efflux of potassium ions results in the accumulation of negatively charged ions on the inner surface of the membrane and positively charged ions on the outer surface of the membrane, and a voltage develops across the membrane. So we will have a potential difference between the inner surface of the membrane and the outer surface of the membrane. So potassium ions continue diffusing down their concentration gradient for some time. And as they diffuse, positive charges accumulate on the outer surface of the membrane and negative charges accumulate on the inner surface of the membrane, and again a voltage or a potential difference develops between the inner surface of the membrane and the outer surface of the membrane, with the inner surface of the membrane negatively charged. After some time, the negativity of the inner surface of the membrane attracts potassium ions back into the cell. So a time would be reached at which the efflux, the movement of potassium ions out of the cell down their concentration gradient, would be equivalent to the movement of the potassium ions into the cell down their electrical gradient. And this time, of course, would be reached after we had some potassium ions diffused out of the cell, and the accumulation of positive charges on the outer surface and negative charges on the inner surface, and the development of the voltage across the membrane. When this time is reached, the voltage across the membrane with the inner surface negatively charged and the outer surface positively charged is known as the potassium equilibrium potential. We can calculate the potassium equilibrium potential using an equation which was first described by Nernst, who won the Nobel Prize in 1920. And this equation describes the balance of electrical and chemical forces across the cell membrane. And here we have the Nernst equation. This is the equilibrium potential. M means membrane, E equilibrium potential for a particular ion. And this is the concentration of the ion in the extracellular fluid, and this is the concentration of the ion in the intracellular fluid. So we can use Nernst's equation to calculate the equilibrium potential for potassium. And when we do that, the result shows that the equilibrium potential for potassium is negative 95 millivolt. So this calculated value of the equilibrium potential for potassium is very close to the value which we have actually measured experimentally of the resting membrane potential. So the measured value of the resting membrane potential is very close to the calculated value for the equilibrium potential of potassium. So this clearly shows that the resting membrane potential is due to the efflux of potassium, and potassium is the generator of the resting membrane potential. Someone might argue and say, no, this is not the case, and say that in the resting state the membrane is permeable to sodium, and the resting membrane potential is in fact due to the influx of sodium rather than the efflux of potassium. If that's the case, then let's again explore this possibility. Using Nernst's equation, we can calculate the equilibrium potential for sodium. The equilibrium potential for sodium is positive 75 millivolts, because if the membrane was permeable to sodium only in the resting state, then sodium ions would have diffused in the cell, bringing positive charges on the inner surface of the membrane. And the voltage across the membrane when sodium reaches the equilibrium potential is positive 71 millivolt, which is far away from the measured value for the resting membrane potential. However, the resting membrane potential is not exactly equal to the equilibrium potential for potassium, and this is due to background currents. What is the meaning of these background currents? In the resting state, the membrane is not absolutely impermeable to sodium. Still, the membrane allows a small inward current of sodium ions. And when sodium ions get in, carrying positive charges with them, this would slightly lower the negativity of the inner surface of the membrane. Thus, the resting membrane potential, which we measure experimentally using the galvanometer and the 2 microelectrodes, is slightly less negative than the equilibrium potential for potassium. So now, having finished with the description of the resting membrane potential, and having known that the resting membrane potential is essentially due to the efflux of potassium, now let's describe the electrophysiological properties of the heart in more details. And we will first describe excitability, then we'll describe autorhythmicity, and in the latter part of the lecture we will describe conductivity. So let's first describe with excitability. Excitability is the ability of the excitable tissues to respond to stimulation. So excitability is the electrical response to excitation, the electrical response to stimulation. When an excitable tissue, for example, the myocytes, when a myocyte is excited, the myocyte is excited by a cardiac impulse generated in the sinoatrial node and conducted through the specialized conduction system, and also conducted from cell to cell because of the intercalated discs. When this cardiac impulse reaches a particular myocyte, it stimulates, it excites the myocyte. And when the myocyte is excited, it responds by generating action potential. In general, cardiac action potentials can be broadly classified into two types. These two types are termed the fast response action potentials and the slow response action potentials. Or we call them fast action potentials and slow action potentials. Atrial, ventricular, and His-Purkinje cells have fast action potentials, whereas the cells of the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node have slow action potentials. So this is a fast action potential, a fast response action potential recorded from a ventricular myocyte when the myocyte is excited. It is called fast response action potential because this is the resting membrane potential. The membrane, the cell was resting, the cell was in relaxation, it was in diastole, and the voltage across the membrane of the myocyte was negative 90 millivolts, and this resting membrane potential remains negative, remains stable until a stimulus is reached here. This stimulus is a cardiac impulse, is in fact an action potential from the sinoatrial node. When this arrives, now the ventricular myocyte responds by action potential, so we have very fast depolarization, we call it phase 0, followed by early partial repolarization, phase 1, then plateau phase, phase 2, then complete repolarization back to a stable resting membrane potential. In the sinoatrial nodal cells, the voltage across the membrane was initially negative 60 millivolts, and this voltage is not stable. Rather, it becomes less and less negative spontaneously without the need to have a stimulus. Now this reaches the threshold value and an action potential is generated. So it takes some time for this membrane potential to reach the threshold value, and that's why this action potential is known as a slow action potential. I do not like calling action potentials of the sinoatrial node slow response action potential. I like to call them slow action potentials because the sinoatrial node cells, they do not respond to external stimulation. Rather, they generate the stimuli. These are the stimuli which are generated from the sinoatrial node and then conducted by the specialized conduction system and also from cell to cell through the intercalated discs to stimulate the contractile cells. So this is a fast action potential recorded from a ventricular myocyte. This is a fast action potential recorded from an atrial myocyte. This is a slow action potential recorded from the sinoatrial node, and this is a slow action potential recorded from the AV node. The major differences between the fast and slow action potentials are actually two major differences. The first major difference is in the resting membrane potential, is in the phase 4. In fast action potentials, phase 4, which is the resting membrane potential, is stable, is constant. Whereas in the slow action potential, the voltage slowly decreases, it is unstable. The other major difference is in the phases of the action potential. In fast action potentials, we have all phases of action potential. The rapid depolarization, phase 0, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Whereas in the slow action potentials, phases 1 and 2 are absent. So these are the action potentials which are recorded from the different parts of the heart. So now let's very briefly describe the ionic basis of the fast and slow response action potential. So fast response action potentials are characterized by, this is on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have the transmembrane potential, the voltage across the membrane in millivolts. Fast response action potentials are characterized by very rapid depolarization, phase 0, with substantial overshoot. The membrane becomes less negative, less and negative, reaching the zero potential, and then the membrane potential becomes positive. And this is what we call the overshoot, positive 10 and positive 20. So the inner surface of the membrane here becomes positively charged. Then we have rapid reversal of the overshoot. We have early partial repolarization, we call it phase 1. Then we have a long plateau, phase 2. And complete repolarization, phase 3. Back to a stable phase 4, which is a resting membrane potential. The conduction velocity in the fast response action potential is rapid. In the slow action potentials, if these action potentials are recorded from the sinoatrial node, I will call them slow action potentials. If they are recorded from the AV node, I can call them slow response action potential, because the AV node as well responds to the action potentials generated from the sinoatrial node. But normally the sinoatrial node do not respond to any stimuli. Rather, the sinoatrial node generate the action potentials, the cardiac impulses, spontaneously. So the action potentials recorded from the sinoatrial node are better called slow action potentials without the word response. Slow response action potentials are characterized by slower initial depolarization phase. This is the slower initial depolarization phase. Lower amplitude. Then we don't have phase 1 and 2. Then we have phase 3, which is repolarization to unstable slow depolarization, the resting potential, phase 4. And they are characterized by slow conduction velocity. So this is again a fast response action potential. So phase 0, this is the resting membrane potential, phase 4, and the myocyte remains resting, remains in the relaxed state, remains in diastole, with the membrane potential approximately negative 90 millivolts until a stimulus arrives here, and this stimulus again originates from the sinoatrial node. When this stimulus arrives, it changes the voltage a bit, and when the voltage is changed, This opens voltage-gated sodium channels. We call these voltage-gated sodium channels fast sodium channels. And sodium ions get in. So sodium in fast. And this is what we call phase zero. So phase zero is very rapid depolarization by the influx of sodium through voltage-gated fast sodium channels. Then we have phase one. This is irrepartial repolarization, during which the fast sodium channels are inactivated. And we have efflux of potassium through transiently opened potassium channels. Then we have phase two. This is a long plateau phase where the permeability of the membrane to calcium increases and calcium ions get in through voltage-gated calcium channels, which we call them the L calcium channels, the dihydropyridine receptors. These are all names for these calcium channels, and we also call them the slow calcium channels. Now, during the plateau phase, chemical and electrical forces for potassium and calcium are balanced. So the movement of potassium out of the cell balances the movement of calcium ions into the cell. And as we mentioned in the previous lecture, that catecholamines, norepinephrine and epinephrine, they result in phosphorylation of the calcium channels, hence they increase the inward calcium current. On the other hand, calcium channel blockers, they decrease the inward calcium current. Phase 3 is the repolarization, complete repolarization, where we have inactivation of the slow calcium channels and an increase in the conductance of potassium out of the cell. So the polarity of the inner surface of the membrane becomes more and more negative, and the membrane reaches phase 4, which is the resting membrane potential. So now we have finished with excitability and how the myocytes respond electrically by generating action potentials when they are excited by cardiac impulses in the form of action potentials from the sinoatrial node. And we mentioned that the sinoatrial node is capable of generating rhythmical electrical impulses, the cardiac impulses, independent of any extrinsic stimulation. And this is what we call autorhythmicity. So now we shall describe autorhythmicity in more details. And the autorhythmicity, the ability of the sinoatrial nodal cells to generate the electrical impulses, the action potentials spontaneously, lies in this unstable membrane potential of the nodal cells. So there is a decay of the pacemaker potential with time. So with time, the voltage across the nodal cells, which was originally negative 60 millivolts, becomes less and less negative, and it reaches threshold. And when it reaches threshold, an action potential is fired spontaneously. The type of this action potential is a slow action potential. This action potential is conducted through the conduction system and also from cell to cell through the gap junctions in the intercalated discs, and excites the myocytes to contract. The decay in the pacemaker potential is the electrophysiological basis of autorhythmicity. It is behind the ability of the sinoatrial nodal cell to generate action potentials spontaneously. This decay is caused by a small current of sodium flow into the cell. So in this part, the voltage across the nodal cell membranes become less negative because there is a small current of sodium flow into the cell. This current may be partly specialized pacemaker current specific to the nodal cells, and sodium passes through specialized sodium channels which are present in the membrane of the sinoatrial nodal cells. These sodium channels are known as the funny channels, and this current is known as the IF, the funny current. And partly this sodium current is the inward background current, the IB. The decay is also because the permeability of the membrane to potassium gradually falls, and as a result the outward background current of potassium, because potassium diffuses out, falls progressively, allowing the inward currents of sodium, the IF and the IB, to dominate increasingly, and hence the voltage across the membrane becomes less and less negative. In the latter part of the pacemaker potential, the slow depolarization is due to calcium current. We have influx of calcium through transiently opened calcium channel, T-type calcium channel, which are different from the L-type calcium channel. So the decay of the pacemaker potential with time is caused by the IB and IF sodium currents. IF is a specific pacemaker current. The decreased permeability of the membrane to potassium, and in the latter part due to influx of calcium through T-type calcium channels. And now let's describe the pacemaker activity in more details. So this is the spontaneous depolarization, the slow depolarization, the pacemaker potential of the pacemaker. This is depolarization. Then we have repolarization. Then we have the pacemaker potential again. I don't like calling this pacemaker potential resting membrane potential, because again the sinoatrial nodal cells are never at rest. So in this part of the pacemaker potential, we have opening of funny sodium channels. So we have an increase in the permeability of the membrane to sodium, and we have a decrease in the permeability of the membrane to potassium because of the closure of the leak potassium channels. In this part of the pacemaker potential, in this later part of the pacemaker potential, we have opening of voltage-gated T-type calcium channels, and we have closure of the funny sodium channels. So the membrane again becomes less and less negative and reaches the threshold value. And when the membrane reaches the threshold value, we have depolarization. And this depolarization is again due to influx of calcium, but through L-type calcium channels. So during this part, we have opening of voltage-gated L-type calcium channels, and we have closure of the T-type calcium channels, which were opened in the later part of the pacemaker potential. The depolarization, the proper depolarization of the pacemaker cells is due to influx of calcium through L-type calcium channels. Then we have repolarization, where we have a decrease in the permeability of the membrane to calcium due to closure of the voltage-dependent L-type calcium channels, and opening of voltage-gated potassium channels. An important property of the excitable tissues is the refractory period. In fact, we have refractory periods. We have two types of refractory periods. Effective refractory period, where the cell is unable to be depolarized. So this is a ventricular myocyte, and this ventricular myocyte has responded to a stimulus here by generating an action potential. If another stimulus arrives here, the cell will not respond. If another stimulus arrives here, the cell will still not respond. Here, the cell will not still respond. The cell will not still respond. Why? Because the cell is in the effective refractory period. This effective refractory period extends from the beginning of phase 0 till approximately mid-phase 3. And the cell is absolutely refractory to another stimulus because the cell is already engaged with the previous stimulus and cannot respond to another stimulus. This effective refractory period is followed by a period where refractoriness is not absolute, and we call it the relative refractory period. In this relative refractory period, depolarization is possible, but only with supranormal stimulus. The stimulus has to be extranormal, it has to be supranormal in order to excite the myocyte. And this relative refractory period extends from mid-repolarization to phase 4. In the sinoatrial nodal cells, there are no refractory periods because the sinoatrial nodal cells, again, they do not respond to stimuli. Rather, they generate the stimuli. Whereas in the atrioventricular nodal cells, we do have refractory periods because the AV node responds to the stimuli from the SC node. So similarly, we have effective refractory period and we have relative refractory period. So I would rather cancel sinoatrial word here and just keep atrioventricular node. Now, the long effective refractory period of the myocyte is important. The physiological significance of the long effective refractory period lies in the fact that because of this long refractory period, cardiac muscle cannot be tetanized, cardiac muscle cannot undergo continuous contraction. In the case of a skeletal muscle, in order for a skeletal muscle to perform an external work, for example, picking up a pencil, the skeletal muscle has to undergo continuous contraction. We cannot have an external work performed by a skeletal muscle when the skeletal muscle undergoes contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. In the case of the cardiac muscle, this is not the case. The cardiac muscle should undergo contraction and relaxation, because it is during relaxation where we have the heart filled with blood, and then the heart contracts to eject blood. So here we have the contractile response, which follows the electrical response. So this is the electrical response, the action potential. And during the plateau phase, we have influx of calcium through the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels, the dihydropyridine receptors. And this calcium influx releases calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then the intracellular calcium concentration increases, and this begins the contraction. So now here we have the contraction. Then we have relaxation. relaxation. So the effective refractory period extends throughout the contraction till the myocyte is having some relaxation. So this would mean that the myocyte cannot respond to another stimulus while it is in systole, while it is in contraction. It will respond to another stimulus only when it has finished with systole and has begun diastole. And this is important because the heart should not respond to another stimulus until unless it has undergone some diastole and get filled with blood. If the heart responds to another stimulus while it is in systole, this would mean that the heart would continue in systole and the heart would undergo continuous contraction, which we call tetanic contraction, and this is not good because the heart should have diastole and systole. So we mentioned in the autorhythmicity that the sinoatrial nodal cells is the normal pacemaker of the heart. It functions as the boss of the heart, the pacemaker of the heart. And this is because the sinoatrial node has the highest order of rhythmicity. Its rate of rhythmic discharge is greater than any other part of the heart. And it has got slow depolarization of phase 4, and the action potential is characterized by diastolic depolarization as we mentioned in the previous slides. Can other parts of the heart act as pacemakers? The answer is yes. All slow response tissue have the ability to auto-activate, have the ability to produce action potentials spontaneously. They have autorhythmicity. However, normally the sinoatrial node is the pacemaker. The sinoatrial node, the rhythmical rate of the sinoatrial node is from 60 to 100 beats per minute, AV node 45 to 50, His bundle 40 to 45, bundle branches 40 to 45 beats per minute, Purkinje cells 35 to 40 beats per minute. So this shows that the sinoatrial node has got the highest order of rhythmicity, and it is because of that it acts as the pacemaker of the heart, and all other possible pacemaker will not function as pacemaker, rather would respond to the action potentials, to the cardiac impulses generated in the sinoatrial node. So the fastest pacemaker normally drives the heart and suppresses other possible pacemakers, and physiologically this phenomenon is termed as overdrive suppression. A beat which is generated outside the normal pacemaker is known as an ectopic beat, and the site which generates an ectopic beat is known as an ectopic focus or an ectopic pacemaker. Can we have abnormal pacemakers, ectopic pacemakers in the heart? Normally, no. However, this may develop if any other part of the heart develops a rhythmical discharge rate which is more rapid than that of the sinoatrial node. For example, the AV node or in the Purkinje fibers. And this happens when the sinoatrial node is sick. Or if there is blockage of the conduction of the cardiac impulses from the sinoatrial node to other parts of the heart, as in AV block, when the AV node blocks the conduction of the impulses from the atria to the ventricles. In this case, the atria would beat according to the impulse generated from the sinoatrial node, and the ventricles, because the ventricles, they do not receive cardiac impulses from the sinoatrial node, would have to develop their own pacemaker. So Blockage of the transmission of the cardiac impulses from the sinoatrial node to the other parts of the heart. In this case, cardiac impulses fail to pass from the atria into the ventricles, and the atria continue to beat with the sinoatrial node as their pacemaker, and a new pacemaker develops in the Purkinje system with a new rate in the ventricles. So now we have finished with the detailed description of two electrophysiological properties of the heart: autorhythmicity and excitability. And now let's describe conductivity in more details. The normal conduction of the cardiac impulses, the action potentials which are generated in the sinoatrial node through the specialized conduction system, and also from cell to cell through the gap junctions in the intercalated discs. So an action potential is generated in the sinoatrial node. This is a cardiac impulse. The type of this action potential is a slow action potential, and the sinoatrial node generates this action potential spontaneously because of the decay in the pacemaker potential. This again, the action potential propagates through the intercalated discs. The action potential is conducted through the atria, and this conduction is rapid in the atria because the atrial myocytes are large cells. And when the action potential is conducted through the atria, it results in excitation of the atrial myocytes. And when the atrial myocytes are excited, they respond electrically by generating fast response action potentials, followed by contraction, followed by systole. So the atria contract about 1/6 of a second ahead of ventricular contraction because the impulse has not yet reached the ventricles. And this is important. Why? This is in order to allow filling of the ventricles before they pump the blood into the circulation. Then the impulse has reached the AV node, where we have delay in the conduction of the impulse for about 0.1 to 0.15 of a second. And this delay is possible because the AV nodal cells are small cells and they have few gap junctions in the intercalated discs. This AV nodal delay is important because it ensures that time is allowed for the atria to empty the blood into the ventricles before the ventricles are excited and contract to eject blood into the circulation. Then the action potential travels rapidly through the AV bundle, the bundle of His and the bundle branches. And then the ventricular cells are electrically coupled through the gap junction. So depolarization begins in the interventricular septum, then in the right and left ventricular walls, and the depolarization spreads from the endocardial surface to the epicardial surface of the right and left ventricle. And it is important to note that the action potential spreads through the ventricles, bottom to top, and we describe the physiological significance of this sort of spread in subsequent lectures. Then the ventricles have contracted, they have their systole. This systole is followed by relaxation, which is diastole. The conduction velocity in the heart depends on the spread of the electric current. The conduction velocity hence depends on the diameter and the number of the gap junctions in the intercalated cells and the intercalated discs between the cells. The larger the diameter, the less is the resistance, And the more the gap junctions, the faster is the conduction. Purkinje fibers, they have very large diameter and more gap junctions in the intercalated discs with high permeability, and thus they have the fastest conduction velocity in the heart. And it is important that the Purkinje fibers have the fastest conduction velocity so that all the myocytes are excited at the same time and hence contract at the same time. So this ensures synchronization of the contractions of the myocytes. The AV node and bundle of Hess, the AV bundle, they have small diameter and few gap junctions. And here we have a summary of the approximate conduction velocity in the different parts of the heart. So it is evident that the Purkinje fibers, they have the highest conduction velocity, 4 meters per second, and this ensures that the ventricular myocytes contract at almost the same time. Finally, let's very briefly describe the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic stimulation on the electrophysiological properties of the heart. We have described the effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation on the cardiac contractility in the previous lecture. The heart is supplied with both divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic nerves, the vagi, they mainly innervate the sinoatrial node and the AV node and the atria, but not the ventricles. On the other hand, the sympathetic nerves, they innervate all parts of the heart with a strong supply to the ventricles. Sympathetic stimulation increases the rate of rhythmical discharge of impulses from the sinoatrial node and also increases the conduction of the impulses through the AV node. In addition to these effects on the electrophysiological properties, sympathetic stimulation increases the force of contraction and also speeds the relaxation. On the other hand, parasympathetic stimulation decreases the rate of rhythmical discharge of impulses from the sinoatrial node and slows down the conduction of impulses through the AV node. So, when the vagi are strongly stimulated, this would result in, this would stop completely the rhythmical discharge of cardiac impulses from the sinoatrial node, because it would take very, very long time for the nodal cells to reach the threshold value, and they may not even reach the threshold value. So the sinoatrial node will not generate cardiac impulses if the vagi are very strongly stimulated. Not only this, with strong vagal stimulation, we also have complete blockage of the conduction of the cardiac impulses from the atria to the ventricles. So in this case, the ventricles will not beat, and the subject might lose consciousness for a very brief period of time. And if we check the pulse of that subject, we cannot feel the pulse, and we might say, oh, this subject has died. Then after a very brief time, the subject is alive again. He became awake again. How? Because a part of the Purkinje fibers develops a rhythmical activity of its own, and the ventricles begin to beat according to the rhythm of this part. This phenomenon is known as ventricular escape. So the ventricles have escaped the strong stimulation of the vagi by developing their own rhythmical activity. So in this figure, this is the normal resting pacemaker activity. In here, we have the pacemaker activity with parasympathetic stimulation, so it takes longer time for the pacemaker potential to reach the threshold. So we have less number of action potentials generated by the pacemaker, so we have a slow heart rate. And with sympathetic stimulation, we have the opposite effects. So it takes shorter time for the pacemaker potential to reach the threshold, and we have more action potentials generated by the sinoatrial node, so we have a fast heart rate. And that's the end of this lecture. And here we have the intended learning outcomes again. And thank you very much for listening.